Today I'll be attaching these platforms to each other. That might sound like a rather simple thing, but it is actually going to be a bit involved. There are a number of issues. The first problem is that this upper platform obstructs a lot of the platform below it, which means I'm going to have to paint that area before I install it. Another issue is that these openings that I created need me to modify photo etch ladders. It'll be more difficult for me to determine the correct length of these ladders if I do that once these parts are attached to each other. So while they are separated, I will find the correct length of the ladder, cut the ladder, and then make sure that it will fit correctly. Then, once these parts are nominally glued together, there'll then be some gaps that need to be filled and sanded. And to make it a little bit more difficult, these gaps are going to be in a fairly constrained area. To start, I'll paint the components in XF53. This is the color that I'm using to represent the color of HMS Hood's superstructure. As many of you know by now, I paint the walls first because I think it's easier to mask off walls than floors. I can use relatively few pieces of masking tape to follow the curve of a wall rather than trying to get it to go around corners on the floor. If that isn't clear to you at this point, you'll see when I mask off this area. Although not entirely necessary at this point, I only really need to paint that area that's going to be covered. I do paint the whole part anyway. It'll just give me a better idea of what this part will look like once it's fully painted. After giving the paint a few hours to dry, I then mask it off. Here you can see why I prefer to mask off the walls and the floor. With just 3 pieces of masking tape, I am able to completely mask off this area of the ship. I then paint the deck with XF82. Now to try and figure out the correct length for these ladders. These ladders were originally intended to go from the deck at its full height down to this deck below. Obviously, when I lowered the deck in front of the entrance to the compass platforms, I made it necessary to also reduce the height of these ladders. To figure out the correct length, I placed them in the correct location as is, and then counted off the number of rungs from the bottom of the ladder and cut off the posts at the top of that last rung. As it turns out, this is quite convenient because there is a support post for the handrail that is going to be in the correct location. So I'm able to just cut off the handrail at that point. And as for the excess 3 steps, I actually have a use for those as well, because there needs to be a small staircase that runs from this platform next to the entrance to the compass platform up to the platform at the level where it was originally at. After cutting, I carefully fold the ladder back into shape and do another test fit. That looks like it's going to work out really nicely. I'm not going to cut and fold the other ladder at this time. That's because I don't want to install them immediately. There is going to be still a lot of work that needs to be done before I start putting that photo etch onto the ship. So instead of cutting those parts and then having them loose lying around, which just increases the chances of them getting lost or damaged, I'm going to leave them on the fret and continue with the installation of these components. Now that I'm happy with the color of the deck and the bulkheads for the lower platform, and I know that the photo etch can fit and I can replicate it by simply just looking at these existing photo etch components that I've cut, I can now install these parts. I place the platforms on top of each other and then glue them together using extra thin plastic cement. You'll notice that I'm doing this gluing while all the components are sitting loosely on top of the Admiral's bridge. I'm doing that just to ensure that everything is in the correct alignment. I don't want there to be a problem later on when I go to install this combined area onto the Admiral's bridge. This is just going to help make sure that everything is properly aligned. Once the glue has tacked these components in place, I can then remove it from the Admiral's bridge, hold it in my hand, and then add more glue to make sure that all the bonds are very strong. After giving the glue a few hours to dry, I then add on some putty. This is probably going to be the most difficult area to fill in sand, just because it's very constrained in these small holes. I also add putty to the joint lines between these 2 components. A very thin layer is all that is required. The less putty that I put on now, the less I have to remove in the future. Before the putty has fully set in these gaps, I use lacquer thinners to thin it down a bit more. This is going to just help smooth out the surface without sanding. As I said, I think it's going to be quite difficult to sand in this area. So I'd rather thin it out a bit now and at least try and make it a little bit easier for me in the future. This won't give a perfect finish, but it is going to thin it down and remove a lot of excess and make it a lot easier to file and sand in the future. After a few more hours, the thin layer of putty on the outer edges is ready to be sanded off. It was very thin, so it did dry very quickly. Here I am going to use a 400 grit sandpaper and very gently sand it off until I have a smooth finish. At the back, I also did a little bit of filling. This area is a bit more awkward. I use a file to get in there and clean it up. Now to try and work on this putty in these gaps. The top section is a bit easier to access. I can come in from the side, but these sections that go into the gap here are considerably more difficult to reach. It's a bit tough to get in there with a bar file. The bar file is only just small enough to fit. If it was even a fraction of a millimeter wider, it wouldn't fit in there. But it's very awkward to work in there. So I kind of jiggle it around a bit and hope for the best. It's not really that good, but it is what it is. Then I try some 400 grit sandpaper that I roll into a tube to try and get in there just to help take off the rough edges. But it's also really quite difficult to work in that area. I did expect this, but it's not going quite as well as I would have hoped. I mean, it's not bad, but it's not really where I want it to be either. So then I move on to my round file to see what that can do. It does take off a little bit more, moves it a bit closer to an acceptable state, but it's still quite rough. Well, I've been working in that area for quite a while now, so I think it's time to see what I have. That means spraying this area with Mr. Surfacer 500. Let's see if that can fill out some of these scratches, and let's just see how bad it really is. The external faces I think look really good. Those don't really require much more touch-up, just a little bit of sanding here and there, but I'm quite happy with how that's turned out. And inside these gaps, it's actually not bad. I'm quite happy with that, actually. It's a bit rough, but it's not as bad as it looked when there was just raw putty and plastic. It's sometimes the difference in color makes things look worse than they really are. So I'm generally happy with that. So I'll continue and add on some balustrades to close up this open section of the platform. Once again, it's just a matter of finding some plastic stock that's roughly the right size and then cutting it to shape. Due to the rake of these balustrades, I need to cut it by hand just to make sure that I get it to fit nicely. Both sides are basically the same, as one would expect. It should be symmetrical, so that's good. Once I have two sections that are the correct shape, I then glue them down using Tamiya extra thin plastic cement. And I then fill the gaps using more Tamiya plastic putty. Hopefully it'll be easier to sand these surfaces. But probably not, since it is the same size and basically the same area. Once again, after giving the putty some time to dry, I then attack it with a file, and it actually goes okay. This file is a little bit easier to use. I probably should have started with it last time. It's got a sharper end, which is smaller, enables me to get in there a little bit better. Anyways, I found that that worked quite nicely. Also discovered that extra thin plastic cement can be a bit of a secret weapon. That plastic cement dissolves plastic putty and paint extremely well. While I was installing these extra balustrades using that glue, I noticed that some of the glue got into these lower platforms that I created, and it smoothed things out quite a lot. So I cheated a little bit and just flooded the area with a bit of that glue just to see what would happen, and it actually worked quite well. It worked better than the lacquer thinners because it eats both the plastic and the putty, and it actually managed to smooth it out quite a lot. So keep that in mind. Just be careful if there are any details in the area that you want to preserve, because it will destroy them. But it did, in this specific scenario, help quite nicely. After the filing and sanding and glue smoothing, let's call it that, I then spray the area with Mr. Surfacer 500 to fill micro scratches and to check my work. And I'm pleasantly surprised, it actually looks quite good. That glue trick to smooth out the base of these lowered platforms actually worked quite well. Might use that again in the future. Anyways, in the next video I will paint these parts and install a little bit of photo etch. If you would like to support this channel or see how the ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.